Mr. President, it's one of Congress's main duties, arguably its single most important duty, to provide for the common defense of our great country. And that sometimes means and necessarily entails providing additional funds for unforeseen costs and emergencies in times of war. Troops might run out of equipment or munitions, or might need to be transported through war zones. And it's of the utmost importance that they have what they need, and they can get where they need to go to fight for our country and to protect us against our most pressing and dangerous threats. Now, in the past, Congress provided emergency supplemental funding to take care of precisely these costs. If it didn't appropriate enough to begin with, or if some of these unforeseen costs arose, perhaps in excess of what Congress had already planned for, Congress would fill the gap and would make adjustments to the following year's base budget to account for them. In other words, Congress was doing its job, and it was doing its job in a thoughtful manner, one that was fiscally responsible, one that acknowledged Congress's constitutional role as the lawmaking body and the body responsible for funding war operations and declaring war. But after the September 11th attacks, something seemed to change. In 2001, the Bush administration created a fund called the Global War on Terrorism Account, sometimes known awkwardly as GWAT, separate from the base budget. From then on, what was once emergency spending for warfighting gaps became a general fund that Congress has used for military spending, primarily for operations in the Middle East. Year after year, Congress has anticipated this very type of spending, and year after year, it has failed to integrate that anticipated spending into the baseline budget. When the Obama administration took over, it changed the name from GWAT to Overseas Contingency Operations, or OCO. This is an account that was newly created in that administration, but the Obama administration left the fundamental practice of GWAT in place. This was GWAT by a different name. And when the Budget Control Act was passed in 2011, President Obama requested OCO to be exempted from its defense spending limits. That practice has continued to this day, such that these funds are still exempt from those limits. What has been the result of this trajectory? Well, OCO has morphed into an unaccountable slush fund for the Pentagon, insulated from scrutiny and certainly unchecked by budget spending caps. It's no longer funds that are provided for unforeseen expenses. And no one here really pretends otherwise. Instead, administrations from both parties have continued to ask for billions of these dollars each year, completely outside the budget process, for what really are predictable, ongoing activities in the Middle East and elsewhere. And Congress has continually enabled them, perpetuating this broken, unaccountable system of budgeting and spending. Since 2001, Congress has appropriated about $2 trillion in total from these funds, accounting for 17% of defense spending during that time period, with each dollar adding to our rising and indeed staggering debt of $22 trillion. This is not responsible budgeting, oversight, or governance, and it must not continue. In addition to mending this broken, irresponsible method of financing, it's far past time that we reassess the operations towards which this money is going. We've now been in Afghanistan for 18 years, and we've now been in Iraq for 16 years. We've deposed Saddam Hussein, and we've killed Osama bin Laden. We've accomplished much of what we set out to do, but we've also been pulled into nation building in countries thousands of miles away, causing serious harm to those countries and our own credibility in the process. Yet these wars drag on and on, with no end in sight. And unfortunately, the bill before us, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2020, maintains the broken status quo for OCO, authorizing yet another $75 billion, a $7 billion increase from last year. And it perpetuates the misguided strategy we've been undertaking in the Middle East since the beginning of the wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq. It continues funding in dollars, in weapons, and with people, missions that we have no clear end goal for problems that were never ours in the first place. For example, it authorizes almost $5 billion for the Afghanistan Security Forces Fund, and it calls for a stabilization strategy in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, and Libya. But in addition to these dubious nation-building investments that lack an overall strategy, at least an overall strategy communicated to the American people that tells them how these operations will make them safer, there's still a deeper problem. Congress never authorized military engagement in 4 out of 6 of these countries to begin with. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution unequivocally states that Congress shall have the power to declare war. Congress, not the President, not the Pentagon, not someone else in the executive branch, but Congress, regardless of whether engagement in a particular country may or may not be a worthy foreign policy goal. We cannot escape this point. The founders could not have been clearer. The executive branch must have authorization from Congress to go to war. This was understood at the time of the founding. It was written into Federalist 69, where Alexander Hamilton explained that this is one of the distinguishing characteristics between our system and the system from which we broke away, our London-based national government, headed by a king who had the authority to start a war on his own without consulting his parliament. Our system was to be different, so they put the power to declare war in Congress. Why? Well, it's because it's the branch of government most accountable to the people at the most regular intervals through elections. And they did it this way, they designed it this way, precisely because they understood what is at stake when we go to war. It's not only our precious financial resources on the line, but our most precious human resources, the brave men and women who are willing to lay down their lives when we go to war. So they intended these decisions to be debated and discussed and considered with utmost deliberation and consideration in front of the American people by their elected accountable representatives. For these same reasons, Mr. President, it's as much Congress's duty to take an active role in prudently overseeing the operations that it has authorized and denying funds to those it has not. Unfortunately, this National Defense Authorization Act largely falls short here, too. Because first, instead of perpetuating these seemingly indefinite wars, it ought to actively prepare a strategy to phase out our engagement in the Middle East, particularly for authorizations of force that have lasted for almost 20 years. And second, for any remaining authorizations, it ought to aim for using our resources and our personnel in a way that's far more efficient than the status quo. Meanwhile, the world has not been static since we began the war on terror. Our country is facing new threats. The national defense strategy laid out by President Trump and the administration does refocus our efforts on stemming the threats posed by Russia and China. And this NDAA does reflect some of that strategy by addressing some of our most immediate needs to counter them. For instance, it reaffirms defense commitments in the Indo-Pacific and in the Baltic states, as well as information gathering on technical and nuclear capabilities that can be found in both countries. And it also prioritizes the Arctic region, which both Russia and China are seeking to leverage. But there are other threats that this NDAA fails to address, namely our threats in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, it lacks a comprehensive defense strategy or plan for the Western Hemisphere entirely. It is by no means prudent to ignore our neighbors to the south, especially given the rampant instability throughout the region, including that caused by the Maduro regime in Venezuela. Indeed, if we fail to secure our borders from the immediate threats we face in the Western Hemisphere, it could become impossible to truly provide for our nation's common defense. Mr. President, we ought to reject the status quo and reject the failures evident in this bill and the process that brings it to us. What we should be doing is drawing down our OCO account and integrating this spending into the $642.5 billion baseline defense budget. We should be having a real debate over whether or not we should continue to be entrenched in the Middle East. And we should be adjusting our defense strategy and the dollars behind that defense strategy to address the most pressing threats we face today. These matters are some of the most important decisions that we will ever be called upon to make in this body as United States senators, as officers within the legislative branch of government who are sworn to uphold, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And we should take the time to get these things right. They merit debate over the course of months, not simply days or weeks. And they merit not just the participation of the Armed Services Committee members, but the active participation and the utmost care and diligence of all 535 members of Congress, who themselves each have taken an oath to uphold, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. It's about time, Mr. President, that Congress exercise its most solemn duty of prudently budgeting and strategizing to protect the American people, providing for the common defense requires nothing less. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.